Sydney World Pride 2023, we're going to be doing some extra conversations over the next 3 weeks. So make sure you get your downloads during Sydney World Pride 2023. And make sure you participate in Sydney World Pride. There's literally hundreds of things for everyone to get involved with. Get your tickets, get out there and support. Australia will show the rest of the world how to party. Now on with the show. Our next guest has come a long way from growing up in Perth, Australia. In the 90s, broke into the drag king scene, performed and hosted in the Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras for QueerTV, and won the Sydney Diva Awards in 2003, 4 and 5. Welcome to the show, Sexy Galexy. Now, you grew up in Perth, WA. Now, as a child, you were saying you didn't really have a sense of belonging.
Yeah, so I think adopted people have that experience. And, growing up in the 70s, I don't think, people didn't really understand much about adopted kids either, if they were adopted out, if they needed support or anything like that. So, initially I had that feeling, grew up with that feeling of rejection. And then when you're very different to everybody around you, and, I had got a twin sister and I was very different. And they had their own friends, and so I didn't really belong with them or their friends, and I was very different to them, and I was very different to my family, and, my mother, lots of mental health issues, and, crazy things like we were adopted 6 months after their baby had died, and we were just a trigger to them. So we sort of copped a lot of abuse in that respect. And so that, and you don't understand when you're a child. So I just, you just feel like, oh, wow, I don't even belong here and I'm a mistake. And then I was told that we wouldn't have got adopted if they would just had one child, but they couldn't afford two. And I'm the second child. So you sort of take that on board as a child and go, wow, I was the one that caused this and I'm the mistake. And then you go to school and I was, I look back and I was like, oh God, I was so queer, growing from the 70s and 80s. And, I had a lot of backlash because of that. So there wasn't a lot of kids that understood me at all. So I was never part of a group of friends or anything like that. I was always sort of, might have had one friend that I got along with. And then so people wanted to try and beat me up and all that sort of stuff all through my school years. So, yeah, I always felt very, very apart from everything happening around me.
It's quite interesting what you were saying about being adopted. I don't think you're alone there. I've spoken to a lot of people about this, and they do have that feeling of that. It's almost like this ingrained, I'm adopted, so therefore I'm not biologically attached to my parents. And I suppose it can go either way in saying that. You've got parents that either embrace you because they couldn't have children themselves, or on the other side of the border, you've got parents who have got a lot of issues themselves. And I don't think in the 70s people weren't getting screened as they should have been, as they do these days, I think. And it's unfortunate that people fall through the cracks and get put into these situations when they're children, especially.
My mother, because she never dealt with her issues, lots and lots of problems with her. She wanted us to be this child, I think, that had died. Yeah. And so she had this picture of us in her head, and we could never match it. And so she would never let us, she always would decorate our rooms for us, and we weren't allowed to put posters up on the wall. So she had this fantasy world going on about who we were supposed to be, and then always complaining, why can't you be like this? And it was always like, because we're not like you, we're from somebody else, Yeah. So that was always a conversation. Yeah. And one of her punishments was, well, I wish I never adopted you. I could have been doing something else with my life. And so her mental health issues and not realising that that's really damaging to a child.
Very. And children take that kind of stuff on board. And I think we're learning more about that, what children are like little sponges when they're young, and everything that happens within their environment, constantly taking that on board. So you're constantly developing. And when people say things like that, it may be off the cuff, but for an adopted child, that cuts really deep. And I don't think back then that people were really realising this.
No, growing up as a twin as well, we were adopted together. They were doing like the twin registry. So we would get pulled out of class, I think it was a couple of times a year, and we would fill out this huge, big, multiple choice document and with all the other twins in the school because they were still learning about twins. And, we're talking about the era where they would go and place twins in specifically in different homes. It was still quite experimental. So, people didn't even, realise the whole idea about being a twin and the comparison. So in terms of that as well, you sort of treat it like, oh, you're a twin, you're supposed to be the same. Yeah. And so when you're not, people then are questioning you, well, why aren't, because I was not the normal one, so to speak, they're all going, well, why like your sister? Like, we don't understand, you're supposed to be a twin. So you're constantly hearing that as well, going, well, like there's something wrong with you.
So it sounds like you had issues on both fronts by everyone around you. So it must have been a really trying time during that childhood.
Yeah, it was. What was fascinating about it, because there was always this constant comparison, I remember thinking, wow, so who am I born into this world? What comes from my parents, like the genetically birth parents? What do I get from my adopted family? What learning traits do I get from them? And then I'm comparing also with my twin sister, our genetic similarities. And then I always remember knowing that there's this whole other element that was independently me apart from all of that stuff. So I was always very aware of all those differences and how it influenced me as a person.
Yeah.
And later on down the track when I was looking at all my mental health issues, that all came into play because I could see them all as separate influences in my life.
Yeah, exactly. And each person has affected you in different ways. So therefore, again, you're taking all that on board. And then as you get older, you have to, as you say, deal with these issues and try to work out, well, where did they come from?
Yes, I always found that quite fascinating growing up.
No, definitely. So in Perth during the late 70s and 80s, did you ever come across a drag king?
I had never, ever heard of a drag king until 1999. So I was doing drag through the 90s, but I didn't know anything about drag kings at all.
Because drag king, as drag queens, it seems like they've been everywhere forever. But drag kings is a relevantly new term compared to a drag queen.
Yeah, drag kings, the term started being widely used worldwide as well. In the 90s, in the early 90s, it started popping up everywhere. And before that, it was male impersonation. But then women have a very different journey with men and that experimentation with gender as well, because there was also the women's movement and the feminist movement. And, a lot of women were like, well, why do you want to be a man? Because, we were trying to get equality. And so there's a whole lot of different reasons why the drag king thing took many different forms before it sort of landed on that term drag king. And a lot of women would go into the circus or into theatre performing as male impersonation as part of their act and not really delve into that drag king thing because of that whole feminist sort of movement. And also being dragged back then, it was sort of taking a step down in your performance career. Like if you went into theatre or circus, it was legit. But if you were into drag, it was, because it was still very underground, it wasn't a legit profession. It was sort of, it wasn't taken very seriously. But then through some drag king starting nights and then that term, really embracing that term, drag king, and then through the performance night and through performing, really changed a lot of people's and women's idea about what they could do with masculinity. And it's like, oh, right, it's not like a negative thing. I can actually take this masculinity and claim it for myself and use it in a positive and a healing way. And that's when the movement really started kicking off.
Do you think that why it was delayed so much because women were trying to get some equal rights out there at the time, and therefore people who thought, oh, male performing drag king is for me, but then they'd get the backlash from the women's lib saying, well, again, like you were saying, why would you want to be a male? We're trying to be female here and we're trying to get our rights and you're setting us back. So stay away kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. And also, issues of there was no space or, women had a different role in society then to find that space in that time. And I know for me personally growing up in the 70s and 80s, it was difficult, and even in the 90s when I started, very difficult. So I can just imagine how difficult it was for women that were before me of how incredibly difficult it was to be even taken seriously. Because, I remember watching shows like Skippy, and they would talk about women going, oh, she's just a girl. How do I deal with that person because she's just a girl? And the father would go, oh, I know she's just a girl, but we weren't anyway equal. We were just women, and we were stupid, not taken seriously at all. And if we had any issues, it was nobody really cared because it was just silly women. So we were struggling with that as well. And because obviously finding our own independence and finding jobs and what was happening in the home front, we didn't have the freedom that men have always had to go off and be able to be a part of a wider community for a very long time, I think.
Exactly. And also, in a lot of the cases, it was the women were going to get married, have children, and keep a house. So in the wider perspective of it all, it was like, well, that's what they're going to do, so let's not worry about anything else. And I suppose this is where push comes to shove in early 70s, where women are like, well, no, we're more than that, and we want to contribute more, and we've got minds, and we don't need a man to tell us what to do, and we can go out there and do just as good a job as any man, in a lot of cases a lot better. As we've over the years learned, women are much better at a lot of things than guys. They tend to look at things a lot calmer and achieve better outcomes than a lot of the males. It is interesting what you say there.
Yeah, it's a fascinating evolution.
Which we've still got a lot of work to do, I'm sure.
Yeah, people's minds are changing, but unless you work on yourself as a person, you don't even know that you're even programmed to think a certain way. So a lot of people live on autopilot, and they don't sit down and think, why do I think the way I think? Where for me personally, because I had so many bad mental health problems, and, I'd made a decision that when I grow up I want to be happy, and I didn't want to be in pain anymore. And so I really strive to work on myself, and to do that you have to take responsibility of the way you think and the way you react in the world, and that's frightening for a lot of people. So to even get to that point, to even understand that you're even programmed by the way society programs you is a huge step. So, unless you're willing to look at the way you perceive the world, the people will never really change. So that's why sometimes change takes so long, but also why change is a generational thing. Because the younger generation will then see how things have slowly changed, and so their programming and perception is different. And so that's why, years later we get these younger kids who are thinking more open, because it's a slow social change.
Yeah, that is so true. Now, in 1993, first time you went on stage, can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes. Well, the first time I ever saw a drag queen show, and, back then there was a lot of money put into it. It's a huge drag queen show. I just absolutely loved it, and I just knew that's what I wanted to do. So I was talking to some friends about it, but I was so insecure and riddled with, PTSD, massive amounts of anxiety. So I remember talking to them about it, going, I'd love to do that, but I couldn't do it on my own. And then one of the girls standing there was like, I'll do it if you do it. And I was like, amazing. So, and they said, I know the DJ, so I can book us a gig at this women's night. And the women's night was on a Tuesday night, because there's no way we could get a weekend. And I was like, great, thinking that they would book us 2 weeks in advance. And then they called me on the Sunday night and said, right, I've booked us. And I was thinking, fabulous, so when is it? And they went, Tuesday. And I was like, what? So I was like, oh, okay, I've got a couple of song ideas. And they said, so do I. So I grabbed my vinyl records and went to their house, and we sat there we combined the songs together and created like a story, and sat there with our vinyls and recorded it on a tape cassette, stop, pause, and created this show mix.
Good old days.
And, yeah, the good old days. Yeah, just came up with this show concept. And then on the night, I remember I was having a heart attack. I was like, what am I doing? Why am I getting up there? And then just before I went to go on, the host goes, oh, so what's your name? So what's your act name? And I was like, oh, never even thought of that. And then the woman I was performing with, is Caroline. She's like, oh, the Fish Festite. And I was like, wow, that's fantastic. I was like, yeah, the Fish Festite. And, so that was the name, the Fish Festites. And our show was about to Jump in My Car by Ted Mulry. And so, you know, I've made this cardboard car. And so I was this guy who was trying to pick up a woman on the street going, hey, I'll give you a ride home. And then it turns out that she lives too far away. So he kicks her out of the car. And then she does a number by the Two Nice Girls called I Spent My Last $10 on Birth Control and Beer, which is about a woman who was sick of all the lesbian drama, so she decided to date this hairy man called Lester. And now she spends all her money on birth control and beer. And so I come out as this guy called Lester that they speak about in the show. And I'm like, yeah, babe, come on, let's go to bed. And then we go to take our clothes off and realise that we're both cross-dressing, where they've got fake boobs, I've got a fake dick, and then this disco version of Phenomena comes on and we do this sort of semi-strip, change gender and do a bit of a mix around the stage. And so that was our first show.
Wow. And so you went on as a drag king, or there was no such thing at that time, so it was just...
There was no such thing. I'd never heard of it. So we were drag queens. I was like, I want to be a drag queen. I want to be a drag performer. So we just did drag. Yeah, and we just called ourselves the Fish Festites. And we'd heard stuff going, you can't be in drag queen because you're a girl, and that was pretty hard. Yeah, we just kept going. We started working every week at that women's night.
So was there many other drag queens who were women at that time doing similar things to you?
Oh, there was one woman, her name was Rachel, everyone called her Rylene, and she was she could sing, and she was a beautiful, beautiful singer, and she was older, and she was into the drag scene, and she would do shows now and then. Yeah, she was amazing.
So you were at the very forefront of Drag King.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really even know that it existed. And I would do Drag King and Drag Queen shows. I just didn't think there was any difference in drag. I thought it was just dressed up.
Well, in a way, it's true, isn't it? You're just you're dressing up as more of a outrageous woman, or you're dressing up as a man.
Yeah.
Well, in 2005, you were one of the first drag kings to perform alongside drag queens at the Newtown Hotel.
Oh, it was amazing. That was Fahrenheit and Porsche Turbo. That was great. I remember a couple of men in the audience squealing out obscenities, but you got that back then. There was always one vocal person in a crowd that would tell you to get out. But that used to happen at the Stonewall as well. I'd be at the bar and there'd be some queen telling me to get out of their club, or it would happen at the midnight shift where they wouldn't let me in. You know, the Newtown Hotel, sometimes you'd stand at the bar and no one would serve you, and it was, you know, everywhere. Even when I used to work at ARC, and you'd get the fag hags in there with their gay friends, and if you stood too close, that you'd get abuse, and then their gay friends would then stick up for them and abuse you, and you'd be like, oh my God, I'm in drag, I work here. I don't think people understood how much abuse that we would get just being in venues or trying to be part of the community, because I always saw myself as a gay man, you know, relating to that scene. Yeah. And I loved being around drag. But to do that, I had to put up with all the crap of people would think that they could just walk up and abuse the hell out of me about it.
And we're talking like 2004, 2005 here. So
more, yeah, 2000, 2001, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, all those years I was really trying to make my way into the Sydney community. Yeah.
And you're getting that kind of pushback. And you'd kind of think too, if anyone was able to relate to someone who's a bit different, is the community itself.
We've never really mentioned the misogyny in our own community. For some reason, I assumed that it didn't exist in the gay scene. So when I was young and I started experiencing that stuff, that I didn't have equality in this community, like I would watch all my friends get Mardi Gras shows and all these amazing gigs, and I would never even get a look in. You know, even when I was young in Perth, and, you know, luckily it's a smaller town, so you sort of get a little bit more leeway, but you'd never get taken under someone's wing or taken seriously, because I'm a woman, so I'm not taken seriously. And that was another thing. It was like that mentality, that program. No one's going to take you seriously. And that sort of an underlying current and it was constant. And it was very frustrating. I think it was an area that was very misunderstood, and I don't think the community understood how severe it was for some of us to try and be accepted, and that the passive aggression that was happening in our community is really hard. And you try and say something about it and you were seen as a troublemaker. You know, you get the eye roll and then people ignore you and stop talking to you, and it was all that going on. So it was like sometimes you just put up with it for years. You want to still have that bit of space that you have, And you don't want to let that go because you work so hard for it. It's like you just keep your mouth shut and deal with what's going on.
And did you find that as more drag kings came onto the scene that got a little bit easier moving forward?
Well, I worked my ass off to get that piece of Sydney that I had. People didn't realise how hard I worked for that. So it sort of didn't make it easier. It was harder.
So you persevered, no doubt, because where you are today is pretty amazing. You've done some amazing stuff, including you performed at Mardi Gras, but you also hosted Mardi Gras for QueerTV.
Yeah, so I did that for a couple of years. So that was amazing. So Pandora Box and Chris, different. They just saw people as very equal, which was great. So that there was those sort of people in the community. And so that was amazing. I mean, that sort of experience won't happen again. You know, to be able to stand on Oxford Street and host a parade, that was an incredible experience.
Yeah, and to be there, and as you were saying, with all the pushback that you've had in the early stages, to actually be there and host Mardi Gras, it's a pretty amazing achievement. So in 2003, 4 and 5, you won Sydney's Diva Award.
Yeah. So when I got to Sydney and obviously saw the Diva Awards, and I was always very jealous that there was nothing really for the women in there. And so I remember I always kept going up to Injust and going, hey, when are you going to put drag kings in divas? And there was always like an uncomfortable, like quiet moment, few eye rolls, And because, I was very intense because I was so passionate about what I wanted. So I could get into people's faces in the club scene. So I was like, I thought to myself, how am I going to do this? And I was like, you know what? We need to get more drag king exposure. And the only way to do that is to get a show in one of the big clubs. And so we've got all that full page advertising in all the gay rags. So we start getting that exposure. And then once we've got that exposure, that means that, they'll put us into Diva Awards. So that's when I was like, right, I need to get a show at ARC. So I went and did a proposal with another friend at ARC, and they accepted it. We had a joint night with Portia. So that was the first half of the night. Then I was the second half of the night, and did a production show. So I produced a production show. I had Dallas Delaforce and Divinal in it, and it went really well. And then we started getting the advertising in there. The advertising started getting pumped, and then you started seeing more drag presence in the weekly papers. And then from there, I went on, they ended up giving me the whole room downstairs. And then from there, they ended up giving me the whole club. So then from that, and also I was doing a Wednesday night Kingki Kingdom. So there was, all of a sudden, there was drag king representation and in the full page advertising starting to happen on a weekly basis. So all of a sudden, you started seeing all this drag king stuff coming through. And then one day, Ian told me, he goes, great, drag kings are now in divas. And I was like, fantastic.
Wow.
I just had to really work on having that presence there to go, yeah, drag kings are here. You just had to put it in front of their eyes for them to see.
Because you've done so much, you just got to Google your name and the reams and reams of pages that come up with all the different things you've been in. There's so much. And I was surprised when I was doing some research, and I just thought, you're literally everywhere.
Yeah, but it's interesting the amount that I've done, yet I just still don't get those opportunities drag queens get. It's a real push because of also RuPaul's Drag Race. Everyone just thinks drag queen because people still don't know about drag kings. I have to have people push me going, oh, you want a drag queen? Oh, no, I've got a drag king on my book. What about a drag king? And then sort of do the whole spiel. And so it's still something that's still trying to get out there. When you have any sort of big event, there'll be 6 drag queens. I was like, oh, okay, maybe we should put a drag king in there. And so there still isn't really that equality, but it's getting there. And, you've got to appreciate change. And change doesn't happen overnight, but change is happening. It also means that we have to have these conversations about how we've treated our own community and how we see our own community and be responsible for the fact that it's had huge internal struggles that we're yet to still really address and talk about.
Yeah, it's so very true. So tell us a bit more about what is King for a Day workshop that you do.
That's an intense one-day workshop where we go through a bit of everything. So we go through makeup, so they'll put a face on. We'll go through some customizing of the costumes. We'll talk about character work. We'll talk about package, what you can use in your package, and just all those little tips and tricks on how to just get that look happening and how to polish it. And then that night we do a cabaret show, and anyone who was wanting to perform will have their show already ready, and then I quickly have a look at it and just help them develop that for that night, give them tips and tricks on how to deal with those nerves. How do you deal with not knowing what to do on stage? If you're not a dancer, or, you know, all those little things, I have a look at what they've got and then just give them advice on how to bring it in and make it a bit more of a solid performance. Cross those T's and dot those I's when you do drag.
There's a lot that goes into being a drag king. It's not just wake up, get out of bed and throw on a suit and go, oh, I'm a drag king. There's a lot more that goes into that.
Well, it's all the same elements as a drag queen.
Yeah.
I don't see the difference.
No, well, there's not. In some cases, I suppose it's probably a little harder.
If you've got big boobs, yes.
Yeah, well, that's true.
Very hard. As someone I've had a breast reduction, had very, very large breasts, very hard.
I'm sure that's in the workshop, 101.
Oh, how to bind. Oh, yeah. How to bind the big girls, yep. Because there's a trick to it. And if you don't know the trick, they'll just get all over the place because they're heavy.
I'll take your word on that one. Now, are you doing anything for World Pride?
Yes, so I'm organising an Australian Drag King History exhibition. So it's a legacy and an archival project. So, you know, I know there's a lot of drag kings that haven't put their stuff into any queer collections yet, or there isn't much stuff. A lot of it was in boxes and things like that. And so I wanted to do this so it can create a package so anyone that wants to know about a drag king history can easily see a bunch of information that's from a particular timeline and everything before 2006. So I wanted to do it before social media because it was an amazing drag king movement in Australia, all over Australia. And some of the people that have continued to do drag king or that influenced the drag king movements where they lived. So I've approached them to go through their archives. And so we're collecting print media, posters, flyers, old photographs, personal archives, personal photos to get together and along with stories about our time and our movement. So that's at the Chrissy Cotter Gallery. And we're also having a Q&A on Saturday the 18th. So people can come and talk to us on all different levels about our experience of drag. And then on the 18th that night, Club King is doing a Legends edition. So I'm bringing some of those old school kings to Sydney for a show.
Wow, that sounds amazing.
It's a lot of work. But yeah, it's going to be incredible. And I'm also doing a night called FOXY, which is going to be a Mardi Gras recovery party at the Loft. So it's about employing AFAB people. It's a party for women and all of their gorgeous friends. And it starts at 2 p.m. and we're going to have live singing, drag performances all day. So we're going to try and encourage people to come for a nice long recovery long lunch. Bringing up Deb Waters, who was an amazing DJ in the Melbourne warehouse parties back in the 90s and early 2000s. Yeah, so that's just about supporting us and AFAB women, all different sorts of performers, young and old, in a space where people can come in. There's plenty of places to sit. There's lots of food on offer where people can come in and we can entertain you. You don't have to entertain yourselves. Come in and just enjoy the afternoon.
And we'll make sure we put all the details in the show notes too, coming up to Mardi Gras, because I think pretty amazing and pretty huge too.
Oh, yeah, there's so much going, so many amazing exhibitions, so much amazing theatre and parties, and it's just, we need it. Sydney needs it, so it's super exciting.
And it's going to involve everyone, which is really good to see. Bring the community together and show the rest of the world what we can do.
Yeah, it's exciting.
Now, we like to ask all our guests this question. If you could go back and tell your younger self anything, what would it be?
I think I would go back and tell myself that it's not my fault and it's not me, to go and get help and go and speak to somebody, because that's the only way that I'm going to get through what's happening in my mind and to have a happier life.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on a side note, did you know that you've got a greeting card? I thought that was pretty outrageous.
Is that from Two Brides to Death?
Yeah.
Yes, I saw that.
What a long way you've come from born in Perth in Western Australia, all through the becoming a drag king and fighting for it, to have your own very greeting card.
Yeah, and I bought one and gave it to somebody as a card. Here, have some of me.
That's pretty out there. I don't know many people or many worldwide celebrities who have their own greeting card.
Yes.
Thank you so much for coming on today's show. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much.
If you love listening to LGBTI conversations, make sure to follow. This will help other people find us much easier. And also, make sure that you never miss out on an episode. Thanks for listening to LGBTI Conversations with me, Anthony Doik.